Today, we are cutting straight to the core of how we actually make ethical decisions. In the real world, we are diving deep into applied ethics.
That's right. Applied ethics is where philosophy kind of hits the pavement. It's the practice of taking these, abstract moral principles like fairness or duty and applying them to a very specific action.
Like, is it right for my company to automate 1,000 jobs? That kind of thing.
Exactly. Or even, is it right for me to use this single-use plastic cup? It works on all scales.
What's fascinating, and something the sources really bring out, is that this field, well, as a specific focus of study, it's pretty new, only really emerged back in the 1970s.
Yeah.
Why did we suddenly need this new branch of ethics then?
Well, because development, especially in medicine and technology, it just accelerated radically.
Yeah.
Ethical debates are constantly playing catch-up. Innovation moves so incredibly fast that it creates totally unforeseen dilemmas. It means we often only address the moral problems after they're already obvious, after they're widespread.
Right. Like trying to predict the moral fallout of social media 50 years ago.
Impossible. Or gene editing. We just couldn't see it coming.
So we're basically living in the moral consequences of yesterday's innovations. And that means solving these issues, it can't just happen in a philosophy class, can it?
No, absolutely not. You noted this requires a multidisciplinary approach. You need philosophy, sure, but also law, policy, science.
Yeah.
They all have to come together.
Okay. And within applied ethics, our mission today, you said, focuses on one of the most fraught areas.
Bioethics. Or life ethics, as Van Rensselaer-Potter coined it back in 1970.
Bioethics. So for you, the listener, this is the study of ethical issues that will surge up from advances in biology, medicine, technology. It covers, everything from patient autonomy, distribution of scarce medical resources, to the really huge questions, the start and the end of human life. Okay, so we probably have to start with the abortion debate. It's fundamentally an applied ethics problem, isn't it? Rooted in that one core metaphysical conflict. When does personhood begin?
Exactly. And just for clarity, we're talking about abortion, the intentional ending of a pregnancy, not miscarriage, which is, a spontaneous loss.
Right. Important distinction.
Legally, the landscape in the U.S., it's shifted dramatically. Roe v. Wade back in 73, that introduced the trimester framework everyone knows.
But that changed.
It did. It was later superseded by Planned Parenthood v. Casey in 92. And Casey centered the legal argument around fetal viability.
Viability.
The ability of the fetus to survive outside the womb. Generally pegged around, say, 25 to 28 weeks.
Okay.
That viability standard is the current legal marker, broadly speaking. But philosophically, the debate goes much, much deeper.
Yeah, because historically, thinkers like Aristotle and Kant, too, they grounded human worth in a rational nature, right?
That's a key strand. To be a moral agent, you had to be capable of reason, self-reflection, independent choice.
But, and here's the tricky part, if you hold rigidly to that standard, what does that mean for humans who are entirely dependent, like infants? Or someone with late-stage Alzheimer's losing cognitive abilities?
That's the critical challenge. And this is where the pro-life argument often brings in the concept of potentiality. This draws from Aristotle's idea of hylomorphism.
Potentiality. So the potential to become rational is enough.
That's the argument. The potential for personhood is enough to grant moral status. The idea is, think of an acorn. It contains the essential identity, the form, of a future oak tree. Okay, so the embryo, in this view, contains the essential identity of a human being, regardless of its current cognitive function. It is that thing, just undeveloped.
That's a very compelling line based on inherent identity. But then on the other side, you have secular thinkers like Marianne Warren who just reject that identity standard. They want functional attributes.
Correct. Warren proposed 5 specific criteria she thought were essential to personhood. Things like consciousness, reasoning, self-motivated activity.
Free capacity to communicate, self-awareness.
Those 2. And her conclusion is, it's provocative. Since a fetus satisfies none of these characteristics, in her view, it's not a person.
And therefore?
Therefore, abortion is always morally permissible because you aren't ending a moral life.
Wow. Okay, so we have these 2 deeply held, totally incompatible starting points. You've got inherent identity versus functional attributes. And this conflict, it leads straight to that huge tension over rights, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The potential right to life versus the right to bodily autonomy.
And this is where Judith Jarvis Thomson's famous thought experiment comes in. The violinist.
The violinist, yes.
Yeah.
A classic.
Okay, so for those unfamiliar, imagine you wake up one morning, kidnapped, surgically hooked up to a famous unconscious violinist who's dying.
And you're the only person with the right blood type, the right organs, whatever, who can save him over 9 months. If you unplug yourself, he dies.
Okay, got it.
Now, everyone would agree the violinist has a right to life. But Thompson asks the crucial question. Does his right to life morally obligate you to spend 9 months attached to him, sacrificing your own autonomy totally against your will?
Most people would say no, surely.
The vast majority say no. And Thompson uses this to argue that even if you grant the fetus a right to life, hypothetically, that right does not automatically trump the pregnant person's right to bodily autonomy. It doesn't obligate them to carry it to term. The right to life, she argues, is not an automatic right to someone else's body.
That completely reframes the debate. It shifts the focus, doesn't it? Away from is the fetus a person, towards can one person be morally compelled to sustain another life inside them? That's a powerful ethical lever.
It really is.
Okay, let's use that same kind of framework, bodily autonomy, quality of life, and transition to end-of-life decisions. Euthanasia. Ending a life to alleviate suffering. The language here gets a bit technical, so let's clearly distinguish the types.
Good idea. First, there's passive euthanasia. This is legal throughout the U.S. It's basically withholding life-sustaining treatment.
Like turning off a ventilator or honoring a do not resuscitate order, a DNR?
Exactly. The patient dies naturally from their underlying condition because treatment is stopped or not started.
Okay. Second.
Active euthanasia. Now, this is the termination of life via direct medical intervention. Think administering a lethal injection. This is illegal in the U.S. The doctor is the active agent causing death.
Got it. And the third type?
Third is physician-assisted suicide, or PAS. This is legal in some specific states with death with dignity laws. Here, the physician provides the means, usually a lethal prescription.
But the patient takes it themselves.
Crucially, yes.
Yeah.
The patient must ingest the medication themselves. The key moral and legal distinction is that the patient performs the final action, not the doctor.
Right. So if we look at this through, say, a utilitarian lens, maximizing happiness, minimizing suffering, thinkers like Peter Singer often support euthanasia, don't they?
They do. They weigh the benefit of keeping someone alive against their intense suffering, the cost, the resources, and, very importantly, their quality of life.
And if the suffering outweighs the benefit,
then the choice to end life can be seen as rational, as the action that produces the greatest good, or least bad, overall.
Which brings us to, well, you called it one of the most compelling challenges in the field, James Rachel's, and the paradox between passive and active.
Yes, Rachel's argument. It's quite powerful.
What was the essence of it?
Rachel's basically argued that if passive euthanasia is morally permissible, and generally it is because the intent is seen as merciful to end suffering, then active euthanasia should actually be preferable. His point was that passively withdrawing treatment often means the patient lingers, sometimes for days or weeks, suffering immensely.
Whereas active intervention
achieves the same morally accepted intent ending suffering, but does it much more quickly and arguably humanely. He famously asked, why is letting someone die slowly from pneumonia, say, morally superior to giving them a swift, painless dose that achieves the same end?
That really challenges the core opposition point, the idea that killing is always wrong. It flips it to say not killing in this case could actually cause greater harm, more suffering.
Precisely. But the opposition, of course, counters strongly, often with a slippery slope argument.
The slippery slope, the fear that if you allow it in some cases.
Exactly. The fear is that once you legalize active euthanasia, or PAS, society starts sliding down a slope. Voluntary choice might eventually blur into involuntary coercion.
Like, will cost-cutting hospitals start pressuring elderly patients? Or will people feel obligated to choose death so they aren't a burden?
That's the worry. That potential for misuse and abuse, critics argue, is simply too great a risk. It violates the physician's primary goal, do no harm, and opens a door we might not be able to close.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. From moral obligations around life and death, let's talk about the obligations around scientific advancement. Clinical trials, for instance, they're absolutely necessary, right? For safety, efficacy.
Absolutely essential. We need them to determine safe dosages, check if treatments actually work, compare them to existing ones. But historically, well, there's a dark side. Human subjects have sometimes been treated purely as a means to a scientific end,
leading to huge ethical failures.
Immense failures. And those failures led directly to the codification of the 4 guiding ethical principles that must govern how researchers interact with participants.
Okay, what are they?
First, autonomy. This is protected primarily by the requirement of informed consent. The participant has to understand the risks, the benefits, the alternatives, and be completely free to withdraw at any time, no questions asked.
Makes sense.
Second, beneficence. This means acting in ways that benefit the participants, or at least aiming to, and also benefiting science and society. This principle is often guided by something called clinical equipoise.
Clinical equipoise. What's that? Sounds important.
It is, and it's incredibly difficult for researchers sometimes. It means a trial is only really ethical if there's genuine uncertainty within the expert medical community about which treatment arm is better.
Meaning the standard care versus the new experimental drug.
Exactly. If the researcher secretly or even openly believes the new drug is clearly superior or clearly inferior, they can't ethically randomize patients because they'd knowingly be giving some patients what they believe is a worse treatment.
Wow. So they'd be sacrificing that patient's best interest for the sake of the scientific question.
Precisely. It requires maintaining that scientific objectivity while constantly prioritizing the patient's welfare. It's a real razor's edge.
Okay, so autonomy, beneficence guided by equipoise. What are the last two?
Non-maleficence. Basically, do no harm. Or, more realistically, act in ways that limit harm as much as possible. Research always has risks, but they must be minimized and justified by the potential benefits. Justice. This is about fairness. Equitable selection of participants, not just testing on vulnerable populations because it's convenient, and also, crucially, fairness in how the benefits of research, like new treatments, are ultimately distributed.
And the failure of these principles, well, it's horrifically illustrated by the Tuskegee syphilis study. Ran in the U.S. from 1932 all the way to 1972.
Yeah, Tuskegee is the notorious example, just a catastrophic failure of applied ethics. Researchers exploited hundreds of poor, black sharecroppers in Alabama. They tracked the progression of untreated syphilis, telling the man they were receiving treatment for bad blood.
Oh, so not even close to informed consent.
Not even remotely. And what makes it so profoundly abusive, just devastatingly unethical, is that even after penicillin became the standard effective cure in 1947,
They didn't give it to them.
they intentionally withheld treatment. For decades, they continued tracking the natural course of the disease until death.
That's staggering. It wasn't just a failure of autonomy then. It was a profound abuse of justice, wasn't it? Treating a vulnerable, marginalized community as completely expendable for abstract scientific knowledge.
A terrible stain. And a powerful reminder of why these ethical principles are so vital.
Okay, let's look towards the future now. Human augmentation and genetic choices. Augmentation. This means interventions used to improve function beyond just restoring health, right?
Think of the difference between a patient legitimately taking Adderall for diagnosed ADHD versus a healthy student taking unprescribed Adderall just to, boost their exam performance. One is therapy, the other is enhancement.
Right, and genetic engineering, especially with tools like CRISPR, wow, that makes enhancement a very real possibility, doesn't it?
Very real. And while utilitarians might support gene editing if it eliminates terrible diseases and improves overall human welfare, there are huge long-term ethical worries, especially about focusing only on promoting so-called positive genetic traits.
What's the worry there? The risk to the species itself.
That's a major one. Some ethicists worry that if we start selecting for certain traits and against others on a large scale, we could dramatically reduce human genetic diversity. Meaning if we create a population that's highly uniform, even if it seems better in some ways, we become far less adaptable as a species. We could become incredibly vulnerable to some future illness or environmental shift that our now narrowed genetic profile just can't handle.
So sacrificing long-term resilience for short-term or perceived perfection.
That's the fear.
Yeah.
And that ties directly into the issue of economic justice, too.
How so?
Well, the utilitarian view might actually oppose gene editing if the costs are so high that only the wealthy can afford it. Imagine a future where the rich can buy genetic enhancements for their children, while the poor cannot.
That would just widen the inequality gap massively. You'd have new, literally biologically based forms of discrimination.
And that kind of inequality connects to the whole debate over gene patenting. Remember the 1980 Supreme Court ruling, Diamond v. Chakrabarty?
Vaguely, that allowed genetically modified organisms to be patented.
That's the one. It basically opened the door to patenting genetic material itself. Now, the argument for it is that it incentivizes research and investment. Companies won't pour millions into R&D if they can't protect their discoveries.
But the argument against
is that it allows private companies to essentially monopolize parts of the human genome, essential biological data. which can stifle further research and jack up costs.
The poster child for this controversy was Myriad Genetics, right? With the breast cancer genes.
Exactly. Myriad patented the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes, which are strongly linked to breast and ovarian cancer. For years, they controlled all commercial testing for these genes in the U.S.
Which meant the tests were incredibly expensive.
Exorbitant, sometimes thousands of dollars, making it unaffordable for many patients who needed it and also hindering other researchers who wanted to study the genes.
So the ethical dilemma is stark. Do we prioritize the financial incentives from patents to drive innovation? Or do we prioritize broad public access to essential medical knowledge, even if it maybe dampens the profit motive a bit?
That's the tension. When it comes to human life and health, where do you draw that moral line between private profit and public good? It's a fundamental applied ethics question in biotech.
Wow. Okay, just running through bioethics alone really shows how complex moral deliberation gets when it leaves the abstract philosophy books.
Doesn't it?
We've seen how decisions about life, death, research, they all require this really complicated, multi-layered balancing act between autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, justice.
Yeah, there are rarely easy answers. And for you, the listener, remember bioethics is just one subfield here. Sources actually touch on the whole spectrum of applied ethics, showing just how pervasive these dilemmas are in, well, pretty much every area of life.
Right, like environmental ethics. That field tackles questions like, do we hold an anthropocentric view, that nature exists purely for human use?
Or do we take more of a deep ecology view? The idea that all life, maybe even non-sentient life like ecosystems, has intrinsic moral value, independent of us.
And that distinction has massive practical policy implications, doesn't it?
Huge. And environmental justice is a key application of that, focusing on how environmental risks, pollution, toxic waste sites, climate change impacts are often unfairly dumped on marginalized communities.
The Flint water crisis being a shocking recent example, a clear failure of government responsibility leading to widespread lead poisoning, primarily affecting a low-income, majority Black community. That's environmental injustice in action.
A tragic example.
And then there's business ethics, tackling things like corporate responsibility. The huge debate there seems to be shareholder versus stakeholder primacy.
That's a big one. Does a company's management owe its primary loyalty just to the shareholders, meaning maximizing profit above pretty much all else?
Or does it owe a duty to the broader stakeholders? That includes employees, customers, suppliers, the local community, the environment.
And that choice fundamentally changes everything. How you set wages, your pollution controls, your supply chain ethics. It all flows from that initial decision about who the corporation serves.
So all these fields, bioethics, environmental ethics, business ethics, they all reinforce that main theme we started with, don't they? Policy and ethics are constantly trying to regulate technology and practices that always rapidly evolving.
Always playing catch-up.
Which I suppose brings us to our final thought for you, the listener. We established right at the start that ethics is perpetually playing catch-up to innovation. So, given the absolutely dizzying pace of technological evolution today...
AI becoming ubiquitous, gene editing getting easier and cheaper, companies like Neuralink developing actual brain-computer interfaces right now.
Yeah, given all that, what fundamental ethical quandaries are being created in your lifetime that we maybe won't fully grasp, won't fully comprehend for another generation?
It suggests we have a real moral responsibility, doesn't it, to try and anticipate the unforeseen consequences of today's innovations. The question isn't just, wow, look at this cool new technology. What is our duty to the future? And what unintended harms, maybe even disasters, might we be setting in motion if we fail to apply some genuine moral foresight today?